Welcome to our series on social capital. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the director of the Institute for Social Capital, and I'm joined by Lyndon Robertson, Emeritus Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Welcome, Lyndon.
Thank you, Tristan. Pleasure to be with you.
Lyndon and I share a passion for the concept of social capital, and we each have a long history of working on it, with Lyndon initially approaching it from economics, whereas I came at it from sociology and social theory. And our different backgrounds and perspectives make for interesting conversations and engaging debate. In this episode, we'll discuss attachment value, or perhaps you could think of it similar to symbolic value, and its relationship to social capital. So, Lyndon, what is attachment value, and what does it have to do with social capital?
So attachment value is a concept that I think we originated in our discussion of social capital with some colleagues. And I think perhaps the best way to introduce the concept of attachment value is with an illustration. And for that illustration, I think I will use my wedding band. My wife and I have been married for over 50 years. I'm not sure if I took this wedding band into a jeweler and said I'd like to exchange it for money, what he would say or she would say was whatever some amount, let's say $200. And I would say, I surely won't exchange it for $200. In fact, I can't think of an amount that I would be willing to exchange my wedding band. And the attachment value for that ring for me is the difference between what it would be exchanged for in a commodity market between strangers and what I would exchange it for. So that difference, which includes a difference in value and a difference in meaning, is the attachment value for that ring for me. And another illustration is we did a large survey one time of agricultural landowners. And many of those folks owned farms that had been in their families for hundreds of years or a long time. And when you asked them what was the minimum sell price for their land, they would always come back, or at least 22% of them came back with, there is no exchange price. There is no price at which I would sell. My family expects me to hold on to this land, and its value and meaning exceeds whatever is available in the open market. So if you think about it, it's the difference between the attachment value, what it's worth to you, and what it's worth in the market. So the next question then, of course, is how does something acquire attachment value? And do all things have attachment value? And if that's a fair question, I would say there's lots of things that don't have attachment value. So when I go into the service station and I fill up my car with gasoline, I have no attachment value for that gasoline. If I find another service station that's selling it for a few cents less, I'll go shop there. It matters not to me. Gasoline in my car has no attachment value. And things like that. There are other things that normally we use them up and they don't exist for a long time.
So perhaps as a way to illustrate how we might, something like gasoline might attract attachment value, after the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred in Alaska, we might say that there was a negative attachment value, I guess, and perhaps you can describe this better, towards ExxonMobil gasoline. That perhaps some people, it wasn't a simple commodity exchange. Perhaps they didn't want to buy gasoline from that particular company.
Very good point. In fact, after the event, and I think it was the Gulf of Mexico or whatever it was, the oil spill, I associated Exxon with negative attachment value, and and even though gasoline may still just be gasoline, having exchanges with a company that I thought didn't fulfill its environmental responsibilities produced what I would call negative relational goods, and I didn't shop there, and I still have some feelings about it. So yes, I mean, even things like gasoline, or at least the company that sells them, can acquire attachment value or negative attachment value in the case of Exxon.
So in the language that I'm familiar with, this would be symbols that have meaning and significance. And so the idea of symbolic value perhaps is one that many people would associate with. And that seems to be quite similar to what you're talking about as attachment value. Do you see a difference between those two ideas, or do you think they're quite similar?
I think they're very similar. And of course, there are different kinds of attachment values. So for example, when I think of something with attachment value, I think of an exchange of relational goods between people, and that object acquiring attachment value because of the social capital or the emotional connection between people and the goods they exchange. So for example, I have an object, a ring, again, that my mother gave me. My mother's passed away. It has attachment value because when I wear the ring or have examined the ring again, it reminds me of my mother and our exchange of relational goods, and it's kind of a storehouse of these relational goods that satisfy needs. So in that case, we can think of attachment value as something connected with ex post exchange of relational goods. Now, on the other hand, we could think of perhaps something that we hope will acquire relational goods. I mean, we may buy something expensive, an expensive car, clothes. I've used the example of buying a wedding dress that for several $1,000s, which seems more than what it's a commercial value of a pleasant item of clothing, because we hope that these items will facilitate the exchange of relational goods. And so they have attachment value because we expect them to produce an exchange of relational goods. So now, in the case of religious symbols, or other symbols for that matter, such as mascots of teams or colors of favorite colors or flags or songs or so on, often those kind of attachment values, and by adopting them and sort of treating them as though they are attachment value, is a way of addressing our need to belong. So I go to Michigan State University football games. I'm wearing the colors, I'm wearing the symbols, I'm cheering, I'm doing other things because I want to fit in with those other sort of 70 or 80,000 fans that are enjoying this event. So these attachment values, different kinds, we can embrace them because they satisfy different needs. The need for belonging, the need for being validated, or even because we have a sense of altruism towards others.
So when it comes to social capital, it's the meaning and significance that we attribute towards things that connect people together. So the example of Exxon, that has meaning and significance. We could describe the attachment value that's associated with it, but it doesn't necessarily connect people. So that's not necessarily social capital then, but the mascot that it does have meaning and significance and is a symbol of belonging and connecting people, then that does relate to social capital.
Yes, I agree. And if we, and of course, if we refer to social capital as something connected to relationships that produces these signals, these that satisfy our needs, we're saying, okay, social capital produces those, and by embracing them, recognizing them, we're connected to people or sometimes causes, then that's the way that social capital and attachment value goods are connected. The interesting, perhaps, discussion of attachment value goods has to do with when you try and exchange attachment value goods for money or commodities. And you say, all right, what's the problem? What's the issue? And there's this interesting book by Michael Sandel focused on what money can't buy or shouldn't buy. And it has to do with attachment value goods that we collectively say they shouldn't be sold for money. So for example, my kidneys have attachment value to me. I like them very much and would feel disadvantaged if I had to part with them. But yet there are places in less developed countries where people are willing to sell kidneys for money. We think of boats. Should we offer our boats for sale? And we say, no, we don't think that our boats have attachment value, and we don't think they should be exchanged for money. And you can have a whole list of attachment value goods. And when they are sold, when they're exchanged for money, they often lose their attachment value in a process we call commodification. And we say that is a process of losing value, even though some people have the resources, the commodity resources they'd like to use to purchase attachment value goods. For example, there's a service that you can rent a grandson. If you're an older person and you have resources, you can hire someone to behave like your grandson would. Well, you say, well, that seems a little strained. And we've had numerous cases where we say you shouldn't be able to buy your way into a prestigious university. That's exchanging money for commodity values. Or if I'm incarcerated, I shouldn't be able to buy my way into a nicer holding facility. So the whole idea of exchanging attachment value goods, high attachment value goods for commodities, just because you can, causes us to come face to face with some really important ethical questions that focus on the nature of social capital, what we have come to recognize as sacred or has symbolic meaning.
So does attachment value apply to commodities and goods and physical items, as well as what I would describe as symbols? So if you take a group of people and that group adopts a name, so this isn't a physical item, this isn't a commodity, but they adopt a name, and that name has significance in bringing people together and having attachment effectively to that social grouping. And it can go even beyond a name, which is something that's quite tangible, that people can see meaning and significance in the way in which they talk, the kind of language that they use. The use of colloquialism or slang might be an important symbol that has meaning and significance that brings people together and connects them. Do you see attachment value in all of those things, or only more in the commodity things?
Well, for example, if you belong to an organization and you have a ritual at the beginning of your meetings, you say a particular phrase, or you have a symbol on the wall that represents your organization, and this ritual is repeated every time, that's a process of creating attachment value for whatever this organization is. And we have rituals that are designed specifically to create attachment value for symbols, organizations, causes, and so on. And so when you find, for example, when I attend my sports event, there are certain cheers, certain uniforms, certain things that we do, and we've been doing them for years and years, and they have attachment value simply because they are ritual, they're habitual, they're symbolic, and they're all part of this process of creating attachment value or creating social capital.
Yeah, and at sporting events, often the crowd will wear the team colors. It doesn't have to be exactly the same color, but you wear blue if your team's uniform's blue, and that's what you're talking about. You're talking about attachment value.
Yes, exactly. The color, the song, the slogans, those all acquire attachment value. Now, there's another sort of area where attachment values and commodities, and by commodities, I mean things that are valued in the marketplace independent of relationships. And that is when you have an opportunity to acquire them either through attachment value, sharing relational goods, or commodities. And one of the popular ones that have been discussed in the past are donating blood, where simultaneously you have an opportunity to donate blood for money, for commodity, or you can donate it for free and in return get a small cookie and a smaller glass of juice, usually. And so we refer to those sort of anomalies and say, well, isn't there going to be some kind of crowding out that one or the other disappears? But in often the case, they exist simultaneously. You can sell blood or you can donate it. And what this phenomenon illustrates is that if my reward for donating blood is related to social capital and the relational goods that satisfy social emotional needs, I would prefer that in some cases to whatever the money is. Now, if I'm really down and out on my luck and I have no money, the relative importance of selling it for money may be more important. And so depending on which needs we're trying to satisfy when we donate our blood, we may do it for free in exchange for relational goods, or we may donate it for money. You can imagine going to your neighbor and saying, I'd like to borrow 2 eggs and a cup of sugar. And your neighbor invites you in, you have a good relationship, and they say, well, of course. And then you pull out your wallet and say, well, let's say 2 eggs or $1 or something, or, well, your neighbor would be insulted. And it would be a very unpleasant exchange because it's expected that this exchange for relational goods is also creating relational goods. And it's something more important than the 2 eggs and a cup of sugar. And so I guess what impresses me as I think about these kind of exchanges is how much our everyday life is ordered around the exchange of relational goods, creating attachment values, sharing attachment values, that there's another world that is really important, that we just need to recognize and not be overwhelmed by the importance of commodity markets.
Yeah, and I think the example of giving blood highlights how we operate with our decisions are influenced by multiple needs, or the way that I perhaps would phrase it is by multiple reasons. I think we're talking about the same thing, that the person who is giving blood in exchange for money, it's perhaps not that they don't believe it's an important thing to do, and that they by doing so they are still receiving relational goods, or they're feeling good about themselves, that they're getting external validation. So these may all be needs that are being met, or reasons that are influencing the nature of their action, to describe it in two different ways. But it's just that the relational goods alone perhaps weren't sufficient enough to prompt them to donate blood, and so the money was the extra bit of reason, or extra bit of responding to need. And so this is a good way, I think, to think about our actions, is that we have a tendency to attribute our actions to be responding to one need, or to be one reason. But of course, it's far more complex than that. And there's multiple needs, multiple reasons that influence the nature of our actions. And we need to be aware of that as we're thinking about the reasons why we do the different things that we do.
Yeah, well said. There are some goods by nature that their commodity value dominates their attachment value. I said that one example was the example of gasoline, but there are so many other examples, and I'm saying that in these cases, I want to I'm making this exchange because I want the commodity or the service, or it's simply a commodity transaction. I think one of the interesting examples where they get combined is when we go to a restaurant and we're provided a meal, but then we interact with a server who's, if the server is educated, will do all that he or she can to make sure that this is a socially enjoyable experience. And often I'm greeted with the expression, "I'm here to help you and, take care of you," kind of thing, as though, we're going to have this relationship. And it works, because if I have a pleasant experience with a server, the extra money that is not required by the price of the meal is going to be increased significantly if I've had a pleasant experience. So we on everyday experience, we encounter exchanges that involve both. I've used the analogy in the past of buying an airline ticket with frequent flyer miles and money. And I think there's lots of cases where we're doing the same thing.
And tipping is an interesting example, because there's some degree of obligation to tip in the United States, for example, whereas in Australia, there's very rarely a situation where there's any obligation to tip. But tipping still sometimes occurs. And it tends to occur, it seems, when people want to gain attachment value from the prestige that it demonstrates to their friends who they're dining with, that they have sufficient money and they're wealthy and they're generous, and what that means then in terms of creating that symbolic value to their friends. And sometimes, and I think maybe this is more rare in Australia, that someone will give a tip because they actually really value the service that was provided. But the wait staff won't provide any worse service just because they don't think they're going to get a tip. So I think tipping is a very interesting dynamic of obligations and attachment value and symbolic value and commodity value, I suppose, as well. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. And maybe an illustration of ex ante and ex post attachment value, something that you do in anticipation that you're going to be receiving relational goods or creating attachment values, as opposed to something that happened and I do value it, and I want to express appreciation for that.
Yeah. So we could talk for a long time about attachment value, but we've run out of time for this particular episode. So it's been wonderful discussing the social capital and attachment value with you, Lyndon. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Tristan. Look forward to it.